justice in higher education. We are so thrilled to have you join us today for what promises to be an engaging and thought-provoking discussion. Hi, my name is Taeyang Kim. My pronouns is she and her. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I'm also a program chair of the Educational Change, AERA Educational Change SIG. So I will be facilitating our Q&A session and ensuring that we address your questions and foster a rich dialogue. So a little bit of background of our SIG and the program for this webinar. So our Educational Change SIG values interdisciplinary perspectives that drive justice-oriented changes in education. So this webinar has been carefully planned to illuminate the epistemic dimensions of our training and learning as scholars, which serve as the essential foundations for change making. So I personally believe that understanding these dimensions is crucial for meaningful transformation in higher education and beyond. So today, we are honored to have two esteemed speakers with us, Dr. Leslie Gonzalez, Professor of Higher Education, Department Head of Educational Policy Studies and Practices, and Director of the Study of Higher Education at the University of Arizona. Dr. Penny Prask is a professor in educational studies at the Ohio State University. She's also a director of Qual Lab Research Center and editor of the Review of Higher Education. So now, without further ado, let's begin with our speakers, and the floor is yours. Oh, one more thing, the talk will be recorded and posted later through Educational SIG. And then we're also going to end our conversation at 55 because Dr. Gonzalez has a meeting with her dean. So we will be just we will make sure the time wise for your convenience. So okay, so I will just turn on the recording button, and then we'll let our speakers to introduce their wonderful research and practice. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, Dr. Kim, for the introduction and for some of the framing. And thank you all for being here today. I'm Leslie Gonzalez, and I go by she, her pronouns. And Penny, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself real quick?
Absolutely. Penny Pasquay, pronoun she, her. Good to be here with you all and talk about this exciting work that we've been doing for a long time. I know we'll try to make it engaging with you and leave lots of time for a conversation at the end.
Yeah, we've been doing this work. Penny and I were talking a little bit before this, and this is about a 5 or 6 year project that we're going to be sharing with you all today. So we plan to tell you a little bit about how we landed on the project and how we kept it going over several years and what we found. So again, thank you all for being here. We're presenting today on a manuscript titled Epistemic Injustice and Legitimacy in U.S. Doctoral Education. And this was a systematic review of literature. Can folks see my screen okay? All right, great. We want to go ahead and begin, Penny and I, and all of you, invite you to also to reflect on the fact that all of us are situated on Indigenous land. In our efforts to forge more just education, whatever your role, whatever your work, we just sort of make a call out to think carefully, deeply, and to center Indigenous voices and desires in your work, and to recognize that all of us have some way to repair relations with Indigenous family, community members, friends, et cetera, et cetera. So we just want to start with that land acknowledgement, and again, make a call to move the work past or beyond land acknowledgements in your educational context. So The work that we're presenting on today, Penny and I could not have done this on our own. This is work that came out again over 6 years' time. We did a pilot project with folks that you don't see on the screen today, Dr. Patty Baines and Dr. DNA Liel. But this is the research team that brought together the manuscript that we're going to be talking about today. On your left top corner, you see that's me. Right below me is Dr. Kyle Ferris, who goes by he, him pronouns. Kyle is the Assistant Director for Career Readiness at Oberlin. He was a student while I was at Michigan State, and I had the honor of working with him on his dissertation project, which largely built on this work. So Kyle took some of this work a little bit further and interviewed doctoral students using some of what we had found in his dissertation work.
And on the right-hand side, you will see Jordan Hansen, who has a master's degree from The Ohio State University. And we work together as we should share that this was unfunded, and Leslie and I put in startup funds or different ways that we could work to actually pay the team here, as well as the team at NC State and Michigan State. So that's a part of why it took us so long, because you have to do that work that you're passionate about, and this was it. And so it was such a pleasure to work with that group. And then I'm on the bottom right. Oh. So how did we get here? We really think, let's tell a little story, I think, together about how we got here. I was at the University of Oklahoma working there and met Leslie on a panel at a conference that we were both put on, and we were walking to lunch talking. And then we followed up with just the pain of what we were witnessing with our colleagues in graduate student exams, dissertation defenses. I think I shared with Leslie at the time the story of some of my colleagues doing a high five over a student who was in the process of doing an exam. And because they had figured it all out for her about her next steps, about the dissertation. And it just was so problematic and painful and not okay in any stretch. And so Leslie was that dear colleague that I started to talk, and she shared more stories of the things that we were witnessing regarding epistemic injustice in grad programs. What are your thoughts about that, Leslie?
Yeah, I feel like when Penny and I started this initial conversation, you know, she sharing some of these examples with me, I had some similar examples to share with her. And at that point, we were sort of talking about how there are in academia and graduate school, there are so many different what we call evaluative contexts, right? Evaluative situations where we have the opportunity to assess and to judge and to legitimize our peers' work. And that could be our graduate students' work, our faculty colleagues' work. And as Penny shared with me that example of the faculty who had sort of like, you know, given each other a high five because they like figured out their students', you know, pathway, I said, you know, this reminds me a lot of this concept in the literature called epistemic injustice. And this is a concept that comes out of philosophy. And this is a really short definition that we have. We're going to unpack it. But in short, epistemic injustice represents a condition or situation, an evaluative situation, where a person is dismissed as a knower or where their knowledge is dismissed. Penny, did you want to add to that at all?
I had a chance to have dinner with Amanda Fricker, who was really excited that we were using her philosophical concepts in an empirical, systematic review of literature, that this is the evidence that proves the concepts that she was talking about in terms of just dismissing people as a knower. I know Leslie's going to flip to the next slide that really breaks it down in very important ways.
So whereas Dr. Miranda Fricker, who again is a philosopher, she introduced to the field, largely of philosophy, this sort of concept of epistemic injustice. And again, I had, you know, Penny and I went back and forth, and I said, like, I think we should try to investigate this in the academy and graduate education specifically, given our conversation. When Fricker introduced epistemic injustice, she said, broadly, again, epistemic injustice represents this scenario where there's an evaluative context, an evaluative community that has the power to, again, legitimize or delegitimize, to dismiss or to see knowers and knowledge, right? She said that there are two forms of epistemic injustice. And if you see here on my slide, the first form of epistemic injustice is testimonial injustice. And that's really dismissal of a knower or a person on the basis of identity, right? The example that is often used to help folks understand testimonial injustice is when a child makes some sort of knowledge claim, oftentimes they can be dismissed. And that's an identity-related dismissal, because adults will say they don't know what they saw, they don't really know what they're talking about. And so this sort of age-related dismissal is often used as an example of a testimonial injustice. It's very sort of one-to-one, right? Grounded in other biases, of course. The second form of epistemic injustice that Fricker talked about was hermeneutical. And hermeneutical, for those of us that are educators, is really interesting because it's this notion that there's a dismissal of knowledge, there's a dismissal of a knower, because the evaluative community doesn't have the resources to make sense of the knowledge claim. So, for example, and we'll talk about this in our findings, a hermeneutical injustice might be you have a doctoral student who wants to bring a new framework, or at least new to the department, new to the field framework for their dissertation work. And the evaluative community, the dissertation community, or the comprehensive exam community sort of sits around and says, well, I don't really know what that is, or that doesn't really belong here. And so there's this sort of lack of resources, a lack of vocabulary, a lack of understanding of broader literature. And so this person and this knowledge can then be dismissed. The third form of epistemic injustice, I mean, they're all important and powerful and unfortunate and painful. The third form of epistemic injustice was actually introduced by Dr. Christy Dotson, and it's called contributory injustice. Dr. Christy Dotson I'm a total fan girl. She's one of the few Black women epistemologists, philosophers in the US. And she said, there's another kind of epistemic injustice that we need to add to our toolbox or to our lenses. And so Dotson says, sometimes there are a dismissal of people and knowledge because the evaluative community willfully refuses to engage in learning, willfully refuses to shore up their vocabulary resources, their methodological resources, really their way of thinking about the world and about research. And so the difference between hermeneutical and contributory is that in hermeneutical, there's this possibility that the evaluative community, they may say like, what is that? But they're willing to learn, they're willing to maybe engage. Whereas contributory is sort of just this willful refusal to acknowledge any other epistemic resources. This is really important when we think about, work by, many of the scholars that I know many of us are familiar with. When you think about Bell Hook's work and talking about, Patricia Hill Kahn's work talking about Black women's epistemology, when you think about Indigenous epistemologies. So there are so many different ways of knowing and thinking that are often not acknowledged or willfully refused.
And you know better in that category. You know better, you should know better. Your work is addressing some of this, but yet you still continue to perpetuate inequities in a willful way, as Dr. Gonzalez just mentioned.
Yes.
Just makes me mad.
And in the paper we talk a good bit about, we do a review, I think a mini historical review of how the disciplines were formed in the academy and how those disciplinary boundaries and disciplinary rules even for faculty that may want to learn or may want to engage, sometimes it's very hard to get sort of outside those disciplinary boxes. And that's a really powerful force. In education and higher education where we're situated, I think that we would have, I think, what are viewed as more porous boundaries, meaning that faculty might be more open than in other disciplines, but it's all relative, right? So with this sort of framework in mind, epistemic injustice, keeping in mind these three, distinct forms of epistemic injustice, Penny and I kind of thought about this and kept this in mind. And then we, took a look at what we already know from the scholarship, right? Folks of color, non-dominant folks, women, queer folks, trans folks, disabled folks. We know from the literature that we experience the academy in hostile ways and in ways that are really incongruent to how we are oriented to the world or how we may want to talk about or position our research. Um, and but there hadn't been any, or there had been kind of limited direct inquiry into how that manifests for graduate students. The literature on graduate student experiences and socialization is very important and very insightful. But the question as to how and to what extent grad students were experiencing support or socialization around research and how to talk about research and how to think about research, we thought that that was somewhat of an untapped area. And so
That led us to our research questions, as you can see in the article, and we have here, does a select body of peer-reviewed scholarship across social sciences, natural sciences, humanities, concerning doctoral education in the United States provide evidence of epistemic injustice? We're confirming or disconfirming if it's there at all. And if we find it, what can we learn about these manifestations of epistemic injustice? And as we move forward, I want to share a bit about the research design, about the very systematic review of or literature review. So you've got review of literature, which doesn't really have an analysis. You're using these concepts to really think through ideas in your study. There's also literature reviews, which actually come with an analysis as well. In this case, we did a systematic literature review where we ground it in a theoretical or conceptual framework. It's very rule bound. We are doing an empirical study of the literature here. And so what we did is, as a team, met often and talked about what are the rules or the processes for which we bring in articles and consider it, yes, we want to look at it, or no, we don't. So these were the different methods, if you will, for inclusion of the collection criteria. So we bound our study to 2000 to 2020. And that's in particular because of graduate education and racial and gender diversity increased during this time, as well as did the research on historically minoritized doctoral students. We used JSTOR and actually went into all the articles there that were connected to natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities. We also pulled from a couple other journal articles that were outside of the JSTOR window because we didn't want to limit it just to JSTOR. We wanted to make sure all the journals that focus on higher education were there. We limited it to peer-reviewed articles in English. So this could be repeated in many different languages across the globe in terms of journals. Also, we adopted and retained predetermined search terms. We were looking for empirical articles, even if it was an autoethnography. And N of 1, that's an empirical article in terms of what we included in the process.
And
you can see DNA Leal's citation there. I love it.
one of the things that, if y'all are interested in sort of the systematic review process, in the actual article, we lay out the papers that we retained and the methodological approach that the authors had taken, so y'all could see that. I think because this was sort of our first foray and what we thought was sort of the first foray into these questions for grad ed, we thought that it was good to adopt a really systematic, rule-bound, sort of a very systematic process. But we would encourage others to like look into non-peer-reviewed stuff, book chapters, which would afford a lot, I think, a much more inclusive body of scholarship.
Absolutely. So first question, is it empirical? Meaning, was it based on data? Even if it was an N of one, in which case a few were, yes, it was N. Was it across social sciences, natural sciences, humanities? Yes. Does it address doctoral education and doctoral students, doctoral processes? Yes. Then it was included in. If it didn't, if it was all about faculty, we didn't include it in this study. Does the article address teaching, learning, mentoring, or research training, courses, conversations in the hallways, all those different things? That was another inclusion exclusion criteria. And so from this detailed search, we ended up with a solid data set. We had 743 articles out that we searched through, and we did this inclusion exclusion conversation and so the criteria with each one of them to come up with a solid 107 eligible articles as a part of our data set. So again, this is a part of that boundary making and that inclusion criteria. Here's this larger, and then we're reducing our data set to something very specific with these 107. And then our analytical approach in terms of the next step, our analysis approach, methods for analysis, it was very structural. It was deductive and inductive and constant group check-ins. I'm going to talk a little bit about that difference between inductive, deductive, because I feel like, as somebody who teaches qualitative research, different fields and disciplines use different concepts for this. So you've got the inductive, the emergent, the emic approaches, which are from the participants themselves. You're pulling that data out in this emergent way, right? Researchers' instrument, certainly, but it's emergent from the participants or from the empirical studies that we have. The deductive, that is the deductive, the etic, theoretical coding, those kinds of things where you're taking that information, you're putting it on the study. There's concepts in the literature that we know about, these three forms of epistemic injustice, for example. We already know that these are possibilities that they could or could not be in the data. So if it wasn't a part of the data, we noted that. And if it was empirically there, then we noted it as well. So we have this inductive process and this deductive process that we all worked on throughout this process. Now, here are findings, which I think are quite exciting. I hope you do too. I hope that's a part of why we have this invitation here today, and look forward to you all really taking this work further as we go. But overall, we found tangible evidence of 16 papers, not episodes, but these are papers or manuscripts that surfaced one or more examples of testimonial injustice. So that's pretty powerful. It's not just the episodes, but it's actual throughout the papers. Here are these aspects of testimonial injustice, and we have solid evidence. Did our coding actually in vivo. We did our search in the library in Zotero. We put it into in vivo, and that's where we did all our coding as a team. So to 16 manuscripts with testimonial injustice, 13 with hermeneutical injustice, and then of course 7 with contributory injustice. These were real examples. So it was found that we had these different injustices happening in graduate education.
And one of the things I'm going to go ahead and sort of share with you an example of each of the form of epistemic injustice. But one of the things that the team talked about a good bit is, we surfaced these examples. They met our definition or our criteria for these various forms of epistemic injustice. And the original authors had not necessarily used those terms at all, right? And so this is part, when you're doing a sort of a secondary review of published work, this is some of the exciting things that can happen when you sort of look at data through a new lens. But also, if those authors had maybe approached with that lens from the get-go, they might have also surfaced more of what we're able to talk about in our paper that's published in today. So Penny shared that we found 16 papers with multiple examples of testimonial injustice. And here is one such example. This quote comes from Kelly Slay's work published in 2018. We need to go back and add that site. But I'm going to go ahead and just read it for you. As a reminder, testimonial injustice is about that dismissal that is related to an identity-related bias. And so you'll see here on this slide that a student had said, I think that in lab, when white students speak up, our ideas are, everyone likes them. But when we notice that when minority students speak up, it is like, no, that's not a good idea. So it's a very good, very clear example of how students of color were minoritized students were being dismissed, their ideas were not being treated as valuable in the context of this lab. Now, when it came to hermeneutical injustice, we found, let me remind you, 13 manuscripts with such evidence. And here's an example of hermeneutical injustice. I'm going to go ahead and read this for you as well. This comes from Fox's work published in 2013, a study of Native students' experiences in higher education. The student said, my work with language revitalization did not fit the mold. I lacked a guidance to propel me, and both of my co-chairs came from outside of my major. It was hard bridging coursework. Eventually, the student was relieved when the professors on my committee put aside their department political differences to help me. So here is this example of the hermeneutical injustice. Initially, the Native woman presented work around language revitalization. There wasn't anybody in her immediate department to help her. There was some additional politics around in between departments. But eventually these professors, as the student tells it, were able to sort of put aside those issues and were willing to learn to help to support the student. So there was a lack of resources, an initial dismissal, but then the professors went forward and did some learning and supported the student. This, I think, is probably the most hermeneutical injustice, is where faculty, mentors have the opportunity to really push themselves to be supportive of students, given our topic. And contributory injustice was in 7 papers. And as a reminder, contributory injustice is the kind of injustice that Christy Dotson introduced to us, where she said there are lots of different epistemic resources, lots of different epistemic communities, ways of knowing, and it's the willfulness of denying it, not being willing to engage, and then dismissing the student that is really distinctive here. And so this piece is pulled from a paper by Bathurst published in 2019. I'm just going to read the quote for you. Students in the grad seminar reported that they had been told that they were stupid. They were stupid, a comment that was immediately retracted, but that had already done the damage. And they had been told they were stupid because they weren't including some particular citations that their professor wanted. And Penny, I don't know if you wanted to jump in here on that one and say anything more.
Oh, to me, each of these examples, I hope, are evident, but as you dove in, it was just so clear. And we did spend a lot of time really thinking about, was this hermeneutic? Was this contributory? And so as a team, we all had to come up with consensus, make sure that we all agreed with each item, and then also go back and recode each time. Also, I feel like, so with Leslie and I, that's where you could stop the study, right? Here's the descriptives, here are the elements of epistemic injustice, all 3 areas. But this is where, as a research team, and I remember the day where Leslie, you and I were talking about this, and Leslie's like, are they rules? Are they conditions? What's happening in this moment, right? And so we came together and we're like, wait, what's that next step of analysis? What's happening in each of these cases so that we can actually interrogate this to the next level. So there were specific rules that were happening. First, the independence, being a self-starter, right? If what happened before epistemic injustice actually was set in motion, well, there were all these pieces of evidence where students were a self-starter. They were trying to take initiative, work with other faculty and other departments, etc. They were outspoken, and that in the academy was something that then they would get pushback at in terms of epistemic injustice. And rule number 2, what set this in motion, was about prestige. So prestige, merit, status as a knower. So-and-so has this fellowship versus this person who's actually working throughout their degree program, right? So there was prestige in the academy that then made sure certain people and their ideas were furthered and others were not. Certain scholarships that students didn't get or weren't eligible for, or once people knew that you had that scholarship, you were treated in a different way. Rule number 3 was that knowers and knowledge production are disciplinary bound. So faculty would often say, hey, I want to make sure we're bringing in people from the waiting room. Sorry, I just had a little pop-up. So what faculty would say, I'm doing somebody a favor, because they won't go far as faculty in our fields if they don't pick up this theory, think this way, epistemically, in terms of methodologically, ontologically. If they don't further this particular perspective, I'm doing them a favor, right? So faculty refuse to think beyond their own field and discipline, and often it's mini-me's, perpetuating mini-me's that think or act or take up the approaches that you do as a faculty because you were trained one way. And so that knowledge and really understanding that grad students can have different perspectives than you, or learn from and with graduate students about certain topics, that was one of the things that really was about the disciplinary boundary that we found. Do you want to say more about this, Leslie?
Yeah, no, I just think that this was, as Penny shared, I mean, the team really could have stopped at the findings of epistemic injustice. But then the more that we meditated on the different quotations and read them in context, we just kept on sort of seeing that there were patterns and like when this was happening. And so I think some future work could definitely look at the, as we call it, the rules or the mechanisms that sort of set epistemic injustice in motion. And I think one of the things that we'll talk about in our discussion is that epistemic injustice, as you have probably already guessed, has many, racialized, gendered effects, but the rules themselves, sort of the idea that that a knower is somebody who is independent, who's a self-starter. The rule, pardon me, I switched it. The rule about prestige, those are all racialized, gendered, problematic conditions on which faculty and mentors were granting sort of this legitimacy, this status. And then they got connected to the epistemic injustice. I think there's a lot of rich work that could happen in the future along those lines. And Penny, I'm going to hand it back to you. I think I accidentally started our discussion.
Oh, that's so great. That's so great. So we definitely found evidence of all three in all fields and disciplines. And this was a systematic literature review. Maybe you all are furthering this work with empirical studies that you're doing. We hope so. We hope that this helps to further the conversation. It's certainly not the end all be all. More work needs to be done, of course. But I think with this, it means the socialization process in academia is laden with epistemic injustice and compliance. There's this level of compliance. You have to follow these certain rules in the academy, and you don't deviate from that unless you want to be minoritized in terms of thought and epistemic injustice in different ways. It's often racialized, gendered, or has disparate effects on people of color, women, and it just, there's so many rules, right? And this is evidenced in the literature already. We cite existing studies where people have found this already. It's not new. It's also not okay. How are we perpetuating oppression in the academy and then missing out on important work that could help us further different concepts, ideas, and solve the world's wicked problems if we're continually perpetuating epistemic injustice, right? And so extremely problematic. Graduate students talked about how hurtful these exchanges were in the moment and the long term. And if we're picking this up without talking to people directly, but doing it in a systematic review of literature, imagine what would come up again in conversations with graduate students. So I also, in the paper, we talk about the need for each professional or disciplinary program to dig more deeply into their program, considering what it means in engineering education, in mechanical engineering, in chemistry. I was with physicists earlier today. What does it mean across your field or discipline in terms of perpetuating oppression and epistemic injustice in graduate programs? How can we really flip that cycle? So we look to graduate programs. Leslie, I can't see the bottom one because my little band is out. So maybe you can pick up the last one, the last bullet point there. I think it's just, more research across fields and disciplines.
Just really encouraging further research on this. And I'm going to go ahead and stop our share now. We can open up for Q&A. Really opening up more research for this. I think it was Sergio maybe who commented, could it be multiple of these things at the same time? Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Like one of the things that we often, we sort of toggled back and forth with all the time was, okay, this is an example of testimonial that also led to an example of, contributory. You can't have contributory without testimonial. So we hope that future research continues to kind of look at these pieces more carefully. Right now, I'm actually in a project where we've been interviewing doctoral students across the country who are looking at, we are looking at their socialization processes around research and asking really explicitly, like, how are you taught in your research methods courses to talk about research? And these are hard things to ask about, right? Because they're often like taken for granted and folks don't know that you can question them. And that work has been really further enlightening.
Mm-hmm. Sergio, do you want to add more to the conversation, or because I know we picked up on the question here, but do you want to engage with this? And then we'll also ask anyone else to undo their microphone or add it in the chat. Either way, it's nice when we hear from you if you're amenable.
Hi, everybody. Sure. So first of all, thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I'm Sergio. I use that he, him pronouns. Thank you for this. This is amazing. And this is also in line with what I've been going back and forth in my head with my students. I'm like, okay, how are we part of the problem and how are we thinking about epistemic injustice, right? So amazing presentation. I'm definitely gonna assign this reading to my students and say, here's a way to start unlearning the learning that we've been taught, right? And how we've been socialized. So I love the framing, I love the perspective, I love the focus because I think that that grounded me to be I saw it as the last one, the contributory. I think it's how, yeah, by Dodson, which I love, by the way. So shout out to Dodson. So I saw that, but I was like, oh, I also see it in the other two categories. But I think for me, I was also the processing that y'all did as a group or what you shared. I was like, I'm gonna look for that in the paper because that's data. I think that's key to how are we unlearning this together? That's where I was like, I hope that's in it because I think that's so valuable because it can be this and that. And how are we also processing, categorizing, and putting one or the other? Oh, excuse the reaction. Putting one or the other as opposed to, because I always say the way I was taught, right? It was very much like it's this and it can be this as opposed to this or. And so that's where my mind was at. So I just was like, oh, I gotta put that there because my brain is processing it right now. So thank you very much.
Yeah, two things, if I may react. So the first is I'm so glad, Sergio, to hear you, sort of thinking about how are we part of the problem. I think for me and Penny and for our, our dear colleagues who were in this project with us, that was really the the driver, right? It was like, how do we get this in the hands of other faculty, of mentors? And oftentimes when I use this work to do faculty development, I'm often asking like, how can you unlearn some of the things that, you know, you're probably recognizing that you've done or that you've been a part of in your department? And it's helpful for them to have the examples. The other thing is in the paper, we actually talk about, I don't know, Penny, if you remember, we had such a long conversation about our unique positionalities and relationship to this work, how the discomfort of naming a quote, something when we didn't have maybe that relationship with the initial author, and how that was racialized, you know, and gendered, and how there were feelings about that. So we detail that in the article, which I do think it's really helpful if you do collective work.
And now you can probably see why it took us 5 years to work on this project, this very important project, but it did, you know, here are the pilot studies that we gave a shout out earlier to DNA and Patty, and then worked with the next aspect of the project. But when you have unfunded work that you just care about and know is so important, I just know Leslie and I were both talking about really encouraging people to stick with the projects that you know in your heart, soul, that this is important work that you need to do, then please do it. Find the right people, make those changes if you're able. I understand that everybody is able, and food is important to put on your table in certain respects, and, you know, respect people's many decisions around that. It can, not all the fights are ones that you can take up every day at every moment, because you have to be whole people and take care of yourself in this as well. Pashali, you undid your picture. And also your baby was there, which I enjoyed really seeing. Did you have a question for us, or should I open it up to the group, which is just fine too if baby is not ready to be on camera in the moment? Well, go on and oh yes, hey.
Thank you, Dr. Pask. Thank you, Leslie, if I'm pronouncing your name right. No, I'm fine with the webinar. If I have any question coming up, I would put it in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Yes.
And there's one question dropped in the chat box from Pin Lu Shu. I'm not sure if I pronounced correctly, but Leslie also typed her answer. Do you want to add more, elaborate?
Hi, Pinru. So good to see you. Pinru is an amazing student here at University of Arizona.
Hello, everyone. I just do a brief introduction. I'm the doctoral candidate at the University of Arizona, and just want to share some of my question. I have read this piece, so I just curious about any of your review article covers about the international experience. So as far as we know that some of our international student experience different from like people of color, especially in the US. So like, I think I just want to ask about this. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. And you're so right. Yes, it was so there. It was there with international students, Indigenous students, with students of color sorry, that's my alarm for my next meeting. There were so many different examples, and I think it's important to think about what are the differences, the different contexts, the different rules or conditions in each condition, in each, as well as the multiple forms of layered oppression that happens in different spaces. So all these different factors were a part of what we were trying to dissect and really think through, and want to encourage anyone who's thinking about this work to continue to move forward with it. I know you mentioned it was in class, or that you read it at some point already. Leslie, you mentioned a colleague of ours who used it in class and some of the feedback that they shared.
Yeah, I mean, again, we just thank you all for being here today and engaging with the work. We've had a lot of good feedback from faculty who are trying to, sort of to Sergio's point, kind of unlearn some of these habits that are so ingrained in us. And folks are using this in their classes, and students are finding ways to push it forward. For example, in our data, I think that there was a lot of rationale, clear evidence for pursuing more specific analyses for how, example, Black students experience some of these things, for inquiring as to how international students experience some of this, right? For women, how they experience this, Indigenous folks, how they experienced it. So I think another area of work might be also along disabled students and how they have managed around knowledge production in the academy. So I think that the paper, we hope, provides a foundation for doing these more specific analyses and inquiries. And if folks are interested, I'm more than happy to share with you all some of the ongoing empirical work that I'm doing right now around this topic, to share with you kind of how I'm asking these questions. Because as I shared, I mean, these are hard questions to ask about. You know, it's a hard thing to ask, sort of like, what are the epistemological norms in your department? You know, if you're talking with folks in chem and physics, and not to pick on fields, right? But sometimes this language and the way that we think about these things are more apparent and more common in certain fields and not in others. And so figuring out ways to ask about this in different fields it takes some time.
Mhm. You're so right. And it's often hidden. We can't necessarily see our own or the ways in which we perpetuated ourselves. But yet, when you are a researcher and look at a different field or discipline, you can really uncover some of that in different ways. But I also think that navel gazing is not out of place here. It's important to continually pay attention to the ways in which you're perpetuating oppression when you're talking about grad applications, when you're talking about grades in the classrooms, advising. All of this, we could all be doing better and need to. I think with the current socio-political climate and the anti-DEI, I'm just going to name it in terms of some of the attacks on DEI, on certain perspectives. I think it is important to somebody who's a proponent of freedom of speech. Let's talk. Let's do it. Let's engage in this work. Let's not shut it down. Let's engage in these conversations and further the work, because we need multiple perspectives and concepts and ideas in order to address the issues in every field or discipline, the topics that people are working on with their grad work. Uh, Nita, excuse me, Nita Cody has a comment here. How does one balance teaching academic conventions, citing the reliable source as opposed to biased or anecdotal evidence, while maintaining epistemic injustice?
I think, you know, I don't know, my inclination with this question is to kind of go back to the phrase that was offered earlier, sort of yes and, right? So oftentimes when I will share this kind of work or you know, similar kinds of arguments in faculty development spaces, particularly with STEM faculty, I'm often working, the question is like, well, what do we do with science? Like, where does Western science go? Like, are we just throwing it all out, you know, and just like anything goes? And my response is often like, it can be both. Like, we can find space and we can sort of show our cognitive flexibility and figure out ways to cite, you know, innovative sources, whether it's a blog or it's a community conversation or it's a conversation with your abuelita at the kitchen table. There are ways that you can bring that into the literature that are rightful, that are legitimate, and also have the more traditional conventional sources as well, right? I think for me, my thinking is always like, how do we broaden the epistemic space? How do we diversify the epistemic resources and make room for more? And that can create, in my view, a more welcoming climate for scholars, increasingly scholars who are coming into the academy with different ways of thinking about, talking about, presenting, positioning their work in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that that's helpful, Nita, as somewhat of a strategy.
Yes, yes. I'm recall. So Dr. Waterman, Stephanie Waterman is here and put in a comment about the grant. This not being grant funded, did it afford us more opportunity to really dive into the topics that we were interested in, and the time that it took for processing, thinking together. So that was a part of what she had asked about, and I so agree. And all the concepts that came up. I think that's why that second aspect, we weren't under a time crunch. We weren't bound by a particular perspective or particular grant that drove just one aspect of the program. I also want to, Pashali put in a conversation about intersectional identities, right? Kimberly Crenshaw's important work that people live at the intersections of identities, not where one or the other is prominent, right? And you're all of yourself, right? If you've heard her talk, she does talk about and have slides on that intersection and that center of the intersection and that whole metaphor and the power there. If you get a chance to hear her talk, please do. I know many of you probably have heard her in important spaces. So thinking about that, with this, we were looking at exactly that, graduate students who, and then what did come up, racial identity, gender identity, being a mother, international students. So it would come up, and we tried to name it in the project in terms of people's identities. And of course, we were bound with what the articles already said. And so again, think encouraging people to take this work farther, I think would be really powerful. Do you want to take the next?
Thank you, Dr. Pass. Thank you.
Oh, of course.
I mean, Daryl, Dr. Tokamaiza has a long quote in the chat box, but I'll just pick up on something. You know, you have, I don't know, Daryl, if you want to talk. I'm trying to find you on my screen. I don't know if you wanted to build on this.
Glad you're here too.
Yeah, my camera's not working. I'm here and have a lot of thoughts, so I don't want to explore them too much and take too much time. But the
Well,
connection between what we do as individuals and the conditions around us is just constantly on my mind, and how do we change those conditions?
I really appreciate what you say here around like epistemic literacy and professional competence. I mean, there are like some really practical takeaways that maybe I want to offer as we wrap up. You know, if you find yourself in an evaluative context, whether it's for a tenure promotion case or evaluating fellowship applications or scholarships, there are some, I think, some powerful phrases to stay away from that can signal sort of a questioning, a legitimacy of somebody as a knower or knowledge. So sort of these innocent phrases, kind of like, well, that, you know, that research doesn't really belong here, or they should go to this field. Like that might seem innocent enough, but that's throwing up all sorts of red flags. I mean, if you go into the paper, we talk about the history of the disciplines and how they're these colonial impositions. That there are so many ways that these simple phrases like that doesn't belong here, or why aren't they using this framework? What we would advocate for, I think, in practice is sort of being open and saying like, oh, how does this framework help me think about our field in a different way? Or how I missed this framework, and how might this help me think about whatever student development theory or teacher practices in a new way? So, you know, sort of approaching more from an open perspective and a learning disposition versus a dismissal disposition. That's like a really, it's a small, but I think a powerful takeaway. So really thinking about the language that one uses in those evaluative contexts.
Those are all great points, and then we had great questions, and thank you for the comments and questions and terrific answers too. So this is time like 55. As we conclude our session, I would like to thank you again to our speakers, Dr. Leslie Gonzalez and Dr. Penny Pasqua, for their valuable contributions today. Yeah. And we really appreciate your engagement and thoughtful questions. If you have a further inquiries or wish to continue the conversation, feel free to reach out to them, those speakers. And again, recordings of this meeting will be posted and shared via email. And Educational Changes Weekly serve, and then Research Qual Lab later. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
for-
all.
Thank you. Thank you for creating this space.
Everyone.